Oh.
OpenAI sent out an internal memo to all of its employees with a single, quite stark declaration: Code Red. According to this memo, their rivals are catching up and the company is at a
Oh
critical time.
no.
And if their service doesn't improve rapidly, then they may well be heading towards collapse. Basically, OpenAI is admitting that they're a little desperate right now. And this is at a time where, more than ever, there's quite a lot of talk about an AI
Everybody
bubble
knows.
and what might happen if it eventually pops. I believe we're a little bit further along the path of that bubble popping than you might initially think. Because outside of the media hype and glaze for Sam Altman, shady debt, dodgy financing, and some very questionable government intervention are already playing a bigger and bigger role in propping up the AI market as it stands today. And I only see this getting worse. In private, OpenAI is letting their employees know that the situation is a lot more rough than previously acknowledged, while in public, they've begun this soft propaganda mission to manufacture consent for a government bailout. This is a campaign that's been incredibly well received.
Ah, yeah, so they're getting involved in so many contracts that it will be technically impossible for them to fail, because if they do fail, they're gonna fuck up everything. That's how they're going about to getting the government support.
At the highest levels of government, which has been increasingly aggressive in finding ways to get a head start on the AI bailout, just without ever actually calling it that. There's quite a lot of evidence to suggest that the AI bailout has kind of already started. Parts of the facade have already begun to crack in front of us, and it's being papered over with a little bit of misdirection.
Yeah, I think the US government has parts in Intel. 8.9 billion. That's a lot for a 10% stake. That's a bunch.
A decent amount of lying, and a whole load of creative accounting as per usual. So bear with me and let me make the case that the bubble is bursting, the AI bailout has literally already begun, and we're seeing it unravel right in front of us. So OpenAI's Code Red memo is important for quite a few reasons. It's one of the first times that we've seen Sam Altman actually admit that OpenAI is in fact an actual company that needs to make money at some point. Of course, that wasn't always the case. OpenAI was originally founded with quite a noble goal in mind. They were once upon a time a non-profit, and they had a pretty base mission statement back in 2015. It said, "Our goal is to advance digital intelligence in a way that is most likely to benefit humanity as a whole, unconstrained by a need to generate a financial return." Since
Damn, how the turntables have turned.
our research is free from financial obligations, we can focus on positive human impact. We believe AI should be an extension of individual human wills, and in the spirit of liberty, as broadly and evenly distributed as possible. It's a pretty nice sentiment. The belief
Yes, if you can afford the $200 a month subscription.
was that they would share their findings freely, they'd prioritize transparency over revenues, and they could also pump the brakes if things were getting out of hand without necessarily imploding their whole operation. But then ChatGPT dropped, and basically all of this went out of the window overnight. Within a week of launch, they'd already crossed 1 million users, and within 2 months, they'd rocketed past 100 million users. And in our economy, attention equals dollars. Too many for Sam to turn down. Within a matter of months, OpenAI shifted from supposedly protecting humanity from the robot takeover to actively leading it. They signed a deal to hand over 20% of their revenues to Microsoft in exchange for investment and access to their data centers. They sought out investment from Nvidia, Oracle, and basically every other big tech company to keep this going. And it culminated recently with them abandoning even the idea of being a non-profit and hiring their first ever chief revenue
Yeah, they should definitely change their name. Doesn't make sense.
officer. For a while, if you announced basically any kind of deal with OpenAI, you'd see your share price shoot up immediately. You had companies like AMD, which saw its share price increase by 24% upon announcing that OpenAI had committed to buying some of their chips. What did OpenAI get in return for this deal? Shares in AMD. They might have milked this strategy a little bit too hard, however, because now they're facing $1.4 trillion of future spending commitments that they're eventually expected to make good on, which is a little scary for a company that's currently hemorrhaging billions every year. The infinite money glitch of signing a deal with OpenAI seems to be running its course, which is a big problem for not just Sam Altman, but the whole AI industry. But before we go any further, I do think it is worth asking ourselves one question. What if we're like totally off the mark here? Because if you spend a lot of time online, it's easy to get convinced that everyone hates this stuff and wants it to go away as soon as possible. But clearly, in real life, the views are a lot more diverse than that. And there is an argument that this won't collapse in the same way that, say, the housing bubble did in 2008. In the last few bubbles we've seen, debt has been a central part of it. Companies overextend in their borrowing and they can't deliver on what they promised, and so they're forced to sell off assets to make up the difference. Everyone starts selling assets and it launches a downward spiral as the value of those assets begins to crash in the rush to offload them. And this ripples throughout the whole economy, right? The banks and the lenders that lent the money in the first place begin to struggle because they don't get a return on their loans. Other parts of the economy seize up from the lack of funds available for borrowing, and you end up in a situation where few, if any, industries are actually growing, i.e. a recession. However, in the case of AI, with a few notable exceptions, the biggest players have by and large used cash to fund their projects. They haven't overburdened themselves with debt that would collapse immediately if they couldn't deliver on their promises. And so you can make the case that even if AI doesn't deliver, it doesn't have to have this ripple effect that would spread throughout the entire economy. So we're all good, right? Everything's good? We're good? Well, not quite, unfortunately, no. If there's one thing you shouldn't underestimate, it's the ability for big financial institutions to cover up loans, to sneak them into places you wouldn't expect, and to blatantly try and convince you that something that's obviously debt isn't actually debt. In the case of AI, all of those things are very true. Because while the big players seem to not be super reckless in their borrowing, the smaller players are a bit more brave on that front. At this point, it's kind of an open secret that circular financing or like round tripping has been quite integral.
I mean, that's a pretty blanket statement. If it was really going on, it wouldn't be legal and there would be consequences. We saw how it's working right now. So they pledged to rent computing from CoreWeave, not actually buy back the GPU cards that they're gonna sell them. So it's not round tripping. If it was, it would be illegal. Everybody would be shut down.
Going. And by now, I'm sure you've seen the visual of AI companies investing into each other and propping each other all up to some extent. There are dozens of examples of this, some of which are honestly a little bit overblown, but there are others which I think don't get talked about enough. And so I want to focus on a smaller part of this insane diagram, a little company right here by the name of CoreWeave. CoreWeave is one of those companies that doesn't really make headlines in the same way that like a big fancy public-facing company like OpenAI does. But it is extremely important to be aware of where these guys fit in, because they are, in my opinion,
they're gonna have data centers as well as Oracle.
Like the single best example of everything that's going wrong in AI. CoreWeave is a company that was initially founded to buy GPUs and chips and create data centers in order to mine the cryptocurrency Ethereum. Red flag number one. However, crypto is a notably volatile industry, and in recent years, they've realized that the better use for their entire inventory of GPUs is AI, and thus have begun to rent out this capacity to bigger players like Microsoft. You would think that these guys are on the best side of this whole business, right? They provide the proverbial picks and shovels for the companies that are looking for AI gold. They don't have to develop AI.
Oh, they actually say that it is NVIDIA that is doing that.
Models and deal with all the drama there, and they can just rent out their data centers to companies that do want to use them. In fact, you would even think that they wouldn't need to be involved in this whole circular financing thing, because their business model is pretty straightforward. They buy GPUs from NVIDIA and they rent them out to anyone who...
Yeah, but these are $30,000 to $50,000 each GPUs. So if you're gonna update the whole farm, that's gonna cost a couple of dollars.
Wants them. However, they are not included on this diagram for no reason. Unfortunately, behind this seemingly thriving business is really what seems like an elaborate mechanism, a shell company effectively, that allows big players to obscure the more dangerous parts of their operation. In March 2025, the CEO of CoreWeave did an interview with CNBC in which he said that...
Yeah, look, the debt is the engine, it's the fuel for this company, right? We go out, we find great contracts, and then we go ahead and we go back to our syndicate of lenders, and they give us the debt to stand up the clusters that will deliver revenue to the company.
And boy, he was not lying. CoreWeave has, over the last couple of years, begun to raise billions and billions in debt across its business. They loaned $2.3 billion by putting up their NVIDIA chips as collateral. They then took that $2.3 billion and used it to buy more NVIDIA chips. They recently opened another $7.5 billion credit line by, again, putting up their GPU inventory as collateral, and used that money can you believe it, to buy more NVIDIA chips and build more data centers. If this sounds a little bit sus, you might be right, because they didn't go to a bank for this loan, because banks have quite a lot of rules and regulations and need to be a fair bit more confident that you can pay back the money after the last time they gave out a load of dodgy loans. Instead, these loans have been fueled by private lenders that don't have to obey the same regulations as a traditional bank. This $7.5 billion is actually the biggest private loan in history, and it's being used to buy NVIDIA GPUs. And listen, right,
New
it's not like
records.
these guys are running an especially
Pretty
tight,
cool.
organized ship. In fact, they actually accidentally defaulted on their $7 billion loan. Once again, the biggest private credit line ever, because they funneled the money to foreign subsidiaries in order to buy GPUs, despite that being explicitly banned under the terms of the loan. The lenders actually gave them a pass on this one and didn't try to collect the money, but you have to start wondering what happens when someone does try to collect. Because it's not like CoreWeave has this wide, diverse consumer base that they're selling to. No, they have exactly one supplier for their GPUs, NVIDIA, and they have one client that at times makes up 70% of their revenue, Microsoft. And
No, they had one. So now they're going to have multiple clients. And I'm not sure that was confirmed here. Yeah, so this is how it was presented. Two customer accounts for 75% of CoreWeave revenue. Microsoft 62%. Largest customer in 2023 and 2024. Significant reliance noted in S1 filing. Hidden customer, customer C. Unnamed second largest customer, contributing to 77% of 2024 revenue with Microsoft. So, I mean, there are more clients. And this is also pertaining to the engagement of NVIDIA to actually rent the computing if it doesn't find enough clients.
client that at times makes up 70% of their revenue, Microsoft. And for now, at least, both of these companies seem quite committed to keeping CoreWeave alive. In September 2025,
Yeah, obviously, because they want to offload the risk.
NVIDIA and CoreWeave signed a deal whereby NVIDIA promised to bail out CoreWeave to the tune of $6.3 billion in the event that they can't find clients for their data centers.
So it's not like a one-time fee. This is a recurring lending of the computing power until April 2032, as we saw from through to April 13, 2032. So it's not a one-time payment. This is also why this makes it not round tripping. If they were to buy back the exact GPUs, that would make it illegal. But since they're getting into like a service contract, up until 2032, there's going to be money exchange. And this is only in case CoreWeave is unable to fulfill to reach like its maximum lending computing capacity. So if they are able to find enough clients, if there's enough progress made with AI, NVIDIA wouldn't even need to pay CoreWeave. So it's still hypothetical. So no round tripping here.
To the tune of $6.3 billion in the event that they can't find clients for their data centers that are full of NVIDIA chips, by the way. NVIDIA also owns $4 billion worth of this company, if you were wondering. This whole operation exists just to rent out data center access to Microsoft, who, by the way, then resells it to OpenAI. CoreWeave rents it out to Microsoft instead of OpenAI directly, because having a big institution that's reliable on your books makes it easier to raise large amounts of debt. And despite the fact that this company literally only exists to buy NVIDIA GPUs and rent them to OpenAI and Microsoft, none of the debt that CoreWeave has shows up on the books at Microsoft, but it is there. Literally, as I'm writing this, CoreWeave announced that they were looking to take on another $2 billion of extra debt. And if you can cover your debts, it's not a problem, but I guess that inherently depends on how much faith you have in a crypto firm turned data center provider that can't file the paperwork for one of the biggest loans in human history. I don't know. Maybe they're good for it.
Too busy building the
Particularly
world.
over the last year, CoreWeave has really just become one in an increasingly growing list of companies that are taking on large amounts of debt to keep the AI boom going. Meta, for example, recently carried out its biggest ever bond sale, i.e. its biggest ever round of raising debt, purely to fund its AI project. And it's really a bit of an open secret. In one interview, an OpenAI exec even said, that's kind of been the strategy. How does OpenAI leverage other people's balance sheets? In other words, how does OpenAI get other people to borrow money and then support us, instead of us actually borrowing the money? Because nobody trusts us to pay it back. All of this debt is a real risk that's becoming so big that even the largest
But I mean, there are other companies as well. So, this shit is probably going on everywhere.
governments in the world can't ignore it anymore. In the US, literally half of the growth in the economy this year has come from AI. The biggest governments in the world truly depend on data center construction and AI investment to keep the numbers up, and they're not blind to what's going on here either. In fact, there's been like this huge effort to begin bailing out AI, just without ever calling it an AI bailout. On the private sector side, we've seen interviews like this one with OpenAI's chief financial officer.
We're looking for an ecosystem of banks, private equity, maybe even governmental, the ways governments can come to.
Mom, do you think I can have like $25 billion so I can go to the movies?
Bear.
Meaning like a federal subsidy or something?
Meaning like just first of all.
I mean, because 25 billions is only for the movie. I think I actually need 45 billions because I would like to get some popcorn too.
The backstop, the guarantee that allows the financing to happen.
Basically openly asking the government for a bailout. Over at Anthropic, an AI rival, they've been hammering this idea that AI is a real national security concern and that their tech is so powerful.
Yeah, because if you make it the nation's problem, you also make it the nation's expenses. So they're all trying to offload the prices onto regular people. It's not looking good.
That China's now using it to launch hacking campaigns, and thus they need the US government support ASAP, obviously. But CEOs are always going to be hyping up their technology and hyping up their companies. That's not super surprising. To me, what's most surprising is how receptive the US governments have actually been to this, to the point where bailout...
I'm just gonna get back to this beautiful picture. The bosses of tech giants OpenAI and NVIDIA pictured at the royal banquet hosted by King Charles III as part of US President Donald Trump's state visit to the UK. How crazy is that? Whoa.
Adjacent practices are now making it into actual legislation. And nowhere is this more clear than in what is arguably the most important piece of legislation passed in the US in 2025. The One Big Beautiful Bill. The One Big Beautiful Bill was an 870-page long budget reconciliation package that was passed by the current administration on July 4th, 2025. It basically decides two things, right? Who pays taxes and who benefits from those taxes. And the bulk of the reporting on it focused around things like healthcare, food stamps, and defense spending, stuff that affects mostly the everyday American. A lot less attention was paid to other parts of it, specifically how insanely generous it is to the AI industry, and the effort inside the bill to keep the bubble going strong. Now, if there's one thing you might already know about the One Big Beautiful Bill, is that it contains a lot of tax cuts. And some of these feel like they were almost perfectly designed for AI companies. Because despite the fact that the government can't get away with an explicit bailout, they can definitely do stuff that looks suspiciously like an AI bailout. Let's break it down with an example, okay? So suppose you're a tech company that's embarking on a huge infrastructure project, like, say, hypothetically, building a data center. And let's imagine that this data center is going to cost $30 million to build. Under normal circumstances, you'd be allowed to claim the expenses of the project as a tax break, right? However, instead of being able to claim the full $30 million as an expense immediately, you'd have to spread it out over the expected lifetime of the project. So if your data center was going to last 15 years, you'd only be able to claim $2 million a year as a tax break, i.e. $30 million divided by 15 years. Okay, so this achieves a few things. It encourages these companies to actually see the project through to the end of its lifetime. They're incentivized to not just abandon the project after a couple of rough years. If there are still
But the thing is, we already know that most likely any data center built as it is right now is going to be deprecated, it's going to be outdated very quickly after just a couple of years.
millions in tax breaks waiting to be claimed in the future. And it also saves the government a lot of money, since they give out the tax break in installments. But since the One Big Beautiful Bill passed, this has kind of changed. Now, in the example I gave earlier, the company would be allowed to claim the entire $30 million expense on day one, as soon as the project is operational. This might not sound like a big change, but it's actually like a huge cash injection.
Yeah, so if after 2 years it's not good anymore, they're going to be able to drop the whole data
For the
center.
AI industry. This change allows them to skip decades worth of inflation. They get to fast forward years worth of tax breaks to today, and it frees up the funds to build more.
Yeah, because 2 million and you lose 2% inflation every year. It turns out that if you were to calculate $30 million, what it would be worth with inflation into 15 years, all at once, versus like the sum of 2 million minus the inflation prorated to each year up until the 15 year, it has a lower nominal value.
Or data centers. It also makes it easier for those companies to borrow money, since their cash flow looks better with the big tax break on it, so long as they start operation while the current administration is in office. And this tax break doesn't just cover the buildings, right? It also covers servers and racks. It covers network equipment like routers and switches, and all sorts of different electrical equipment that might end up inside the data center. And what do these breaks cost the US taxpayer? The low price of $378 billion over the course of the next decade, just to free up capital for investment in AI data centers, since that's basically the only construction happening in the US right now. This figure is according to the US government's own budget office, by the way. And this policy, bonus depreciation is what it's called, is like an actual legitimate recession indicator. It's not just me saying that, right? Okay, let me give you a quote from the US government's Congressional Research Service, where they discussed this policy and how it was used after the 2008 recession. This is what they had to say. Bonus depreciation was enacted for a specific short-term purpose, to provide an economic stimulus during the recession. This is a policy that, according to the US government's own research, exists for the specific reason of juicing up investment in a recession. And they were talking about a less generous version.
With the employment reports in the US, with the way that they come back to it after a couple of months and always revise the numbers down, I wouldn't be impressed if after the fact they're gonna say, like a year or 2 years afterwards, you know what, technically we were always in a recession, and I mean, they just try to hide it, and I think it's stupid. We should just take the hit and move on.
That only gave companies half as much money up front. You could argue this is a tax benefit for the manufacturing industry as a whole, right? But AI data centers are literally the only construction happening right now. House building is at all-time lows, manufacturing is hemorrhaging jobs, and AI is all that's keeping the economy ticking over, at least on paper. And this is hardly the only piece of pro-AI legislation included in the Big Beautiful Bill. The Big Beautiful Bill attempted to establish like a decade-long ban on states being able to regulate AI in any way, until senators struck it down by voting 99-1 against it. They tried to sneak the same ban on state-level regulation into a recent defense funding bill, unsuccessfully. And now it's looking like there's going to be an executive order from the White House banning any states from being able to regulate AI for the next 10 years. And aside from the obvious safety concerns, this would now also mean that the states which have been the most negatively affected by data centers aren't going to be able to do anything to slow down new construction. Some parts of Maryland and Virginia have seen wholesale electricity prices literally tripling
and it's
because of all
the
of this extra
citizens
demand
that
from
have to
data
pay.
centers,
Yeah,
with no
that's
real
being passed on to
benefits to the
customers.
people who live there. And stopping them from being able to rein in AI in any way is literally just putting the needs of AI infrastructure over the people who are actually affected by it. And this is happening all across the US government. The light bailouts haven't really stopped with the One Big Beautiful Bill, nor are they all necessarily as indirect as like a tax policy change. In fact, the US recently announced the Genesis mission, which is a project that's designed to
What's the whole point of this, you know? Because you're not even sure, like, the next data center is going to be like the AGI. What are you going to do when you have like the same situation, but now you have a 100 billion data center in your hands that's not generating revenue enough for you to sustain it?
to transform American science and innovation through the power of artificial intelligence, strengthening the nation's technological leadership and global competitiveness. Within 90 days of announcing this mission, the US government
That's what they believe. That's what they believe. But this is the sunk cost fallacy. Freaking crazy.
had to identify any additional partnerships or infrastructure enhancements that could support the computational foundation for this AI platform. And the government's crypto and AI czar suddenly started talking about how AI-related investment accounts for half.
Now they're excited because they're investing in freaking power plants, nuclear power plants. They're just, they're real life villains. That's it.
A reversal would risk recession. We can't afford to go backwards. All very, very bailout coded. And the Genesis mission is supposed to be like about building stronger public-private relationships between the government's AI projects and the private sector projects. And public-private relationships happen all the time, right, in all sorts of sectors. But the timing is especially sus on this one. And it really comes across as the US government guaranteeing to protect AI companies in the event that they overextend themselves and need a client to buy up some extra capacity. I mean, all you have to do is go on the White House website and you'll see like 17 different executive orders all targeting AI and mostly pretty beneficial to them. Far fewer than those tackling, say, like affordability, for example. The reality is that bailouts can come in the form of packages that can be justified in another way. That's one way to get them through without destroying your political credibility. For example, it's objectively true that there is a national security element to AI, and that being ahead of China is important for the US. But that doesn't also mean that AI is not getting favorable treatment above and beyond other industries that are similarly critical to national security. Clearly, the government is already willing to step in and keep the bubble going for longer. And I don't think that's a surprise, given that their economy has like little to no fundamentals to actually fall back on. AI is where the growth is. And I think what scares me the most is that we don't really have any great outcomes that I can see. If AI does succeed on the promise of giving us some kind of
I feel the same way.
super intelligence, then the outcome is going to be mass unemployment and more mass surveillance. And if it fails, then we're headed towards a recession, more bailouts, and a lot of the world getting a fair bit worse, unfortunately.
We're on the same page. That's pretty crazy. That's pretty crazy.